Hi, Brittany here.
And I'm Claire, and you're listening to Eco Curious, a podcast dedicated to bringing interesting, relevant, and local science to the masses.
This podcast is created by the Petitcodiac Watershed Alliance, a non-profit environmental organization based in Moncton, New Brunswick.
Dr. Chiasson, what is the objective of your current research on the parasitic copepod of the Brook trout in the Petitcodiac River watershed?
That makes it all sound a little dry, but
we're excited about it, though.
I'll perhaps frame it in a slightly different fashion, give you a little bit of history. I've been working for a number of years on some headwater streams to the Petitcodiac, namely Hayward and Holmes Brook, which are just outside of Petitcodiac village. Initially, I started the Fundy model forest. It was one of our test sites to look at the effects of different widths of riparian zones. So I had 6 years of backlog data. A couple of years ago, we decided to come back and see what had changed because it was 20 years since we had actually done that site. So we were wondering what had changed in 20 years. So I went back and again, I sampled the fish and I sampled their habitat and took temperature as well. And I was surprised when I looked down the pool to see something whitish on the top of the brook trout. So I said, what's that? So when we were electrofishing, so we finally had a number of fish, we took a look, and on the dorsal fin mainly, on the adipose fin, the two top fins of a brook trout, there was a little white blob. And at first I wasn't sure what the white blob was. I took it back to the lab. I took a sample to Fisheries and Oceans because some of the fish had fungal infections as well. They had infections on the skin. And it came back that it was a copepod. Now, a copepod is normally when we think of copepods, we think of copepods in salt water. People might be familiar with copepods that attack Atlantic salmon. It's a problem in aquaculture. But there's also a copepod that parasitizes brook trout, all members of the salmonid family. So this is what it was. The question was, is this parasite distributed now throughout the whole system of the Petitcodiac, or is this an isolated case? We went out a second year, including this year, and the copepod is still there. From the sites we sampled elsewhere, it does not appear to be outside of that system. We haven't finished our summer studies yet, but for the moment, that appears to be good news.
That is good. Just backtracking a little bit, for our listeners, how do you define a parasite?
A parasite is an organism that depends on another for its survival. The ideal parasite should not injure or kill its host, because then you're eliminating your food source. Mm-hmm. But parasites can go overboard and can result in killing their host. In this case, the main preoccupation is the parasite also opens a site for infection. And some of the fish that we saw had secondary infections, probably as a result of the feeding of the copepod.
So, from my understanding, this parasite is relatively new to New Brunswick. How did it get here, and is it related to a warming climate or human land use?
I wouldn't necessarily say that it's new to New Brunswick. There have been past studies that have identified its presence in the Tapsintac River system. The main thing is we're lacking data. I don't know whether people have been on the lookout for this parasite. That's one of the reasons why within the Petitcodiac system, I've enlisted the support of Moncton Fish and Game. They've received little cards and little vials, and I've asked them if they happen to see a white blob on the trout that they catch to, before they cook the fish, remove it, put it in the vial, and they're going to be bringing it to their next meeting in the fall, where we'll take a look to see what they have. So that's, I hope, a way of expanding our current sampling to a wider area. It's known to be in Nova Scotia, so there's a bit of a question mark for New Brunswick. I haven't heard to people who fish for brook trout, other watersheds, I haven't heard that they've seen it. Is it spreading or something has changed? I think it's likely that climate change, which increases water temperature, we know the parasite reproduces a lot more faster in warm water, so it could well be that it's one of the things that we're looking at.
So you mentioned of the fish,
yep.
And what are the symptoms caused by the bout?
The brook trout itself in the extreme will become leaner, will lose weight. I imagine it'll become more lethargic too, less energy reserves to swim, to reproduce. That's one of the questions I have mainly is what is the effect on reproduction in the fall? If these fish go into the winter thin, emaciated, they intend to spawn. Do they successfully spawn? If they spawn, are there fewer eggs? Or perhaps they might even die during the winter. So it's questions that we don't have the answer to, but we're concerned.
Yeah.
At least for the cases where we've seen the parasite.
So this parasite clearly uses the fish as a habitat, but does it also use the fish as a nutrient source?
Oh yes, of the two sexes, it's only the female that feeds on the fish. The male, its main task is to find the female, and it only lives 3 or 4 days.
Interesting.
So it has to find the female pretty soon.
Pretty fast.
And the female, it has a modification of one of its appendages. It's called the vulva, and it actually inserts it into the tissue of the fish, and it's like an anchor. There's a kind of a big ball of tissue at the end, and it anchors itself into the fish so that it's not dislodged by the current or the fish rubbing itself against the rocks. So then it starts to feed. It feeds off of the mucus and off of the cells, what we call the epithelial, the skin cells of the fish, and it will also tap the blood, the liquid tissue. It'll suck all that up, and it uses it to grow and to produce its eggs.
Now, what is the reproductive success of the parasite? Is it relatively high?
It depends on water temperature. So water temperature goes up, what we call the generation, the reproduction time goes down. So when you're up around 19 degrees, it reproduces approximately every 6-7 days, about a week. So it's very rapid. Each female produces about 120 eggs. So if all of those eggs were to survive, roughly, let's give it a gracious estimate of 2 weeks. Every 2 weeks, you get 120. Those 120 in another 2 weeks produce another 120 each. Population can go up rapidly. I think one of the things that we're trying to find out is whether the parasite is actually coming from brook trout that are in the lower part of the system where it warms up first. We know that brook trout will move into cooler water when it warms up in the summer. We're wondering if it's bringing the parasite with it. That's a possibility.
Now, are the eggs laid on the brook trout, the parasitic eggs?
The way it works is imagine an ordinary beetle or ladybug.
Right.
And on the end stick 2 chopsticks. Okay? And the chopsticks will represent on the back part, the chopsticks represent the egg sacs. And the egg sacs are more or less transparent. Through a microscope, you can see them as little round balls. And there are 2 of those. They're like tails, like 2 tails on the end. And each of those holds about 60 eggs.
So they stay attached to the mother then?
Yeah, they stay attached to the female. And female can have more than 1 generation. So a female doesn't necessarily produce 1 series of eggs and then dies. It can do it again.
How many times?
I'm not too sure. It's a little hard to follow these in the lab, and certainly a lot more difficult in the wild to be sure that you're seeing the same female. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So it would have to be done in the lab. And there's not that many studies that have been done.
Are you planning on doing a series of studies in that yourself?
Well, my colleague doing this project, Simon Lamar, who's a fish physiologist, and he's looking at the health impacts to the fish of the parasites. So he's doing basically injecting the fish with a stable isotope, which is, in this case, it happens to be an amino acid that's used to build proteins by the fish. And the rate of uptake of this amino acid is a function of the health of the fish, mainly the liver, processed by the liver. So we're looking for the rate of uptake by the various tissues, and a lower rate of uptake would mean a fish that is in less healthy condition. So we're hoping to compare parasitized fish with non-parasitized fish, and use this to evaluate, what's the impact to the health of the fish? Is it going to affect its survival? Is it going to affect its reproduction? So we're trying to get a hold of that question through this method.
So far, then, do you understand?
The parasite itself, as far as I know and the literature suggests, is not a specific link to another part of the food web. However, if it was to result in a significant reduction in the brook trout population, there are other species that feed on brook trout, including the sports fishery. One has to remember that brook trout is probably the #1 sports fish in New Brunswick. So if this is being driven in part by warming water temperatures, it suggests that, well, we'll see what the results are this summer, but it certainly suggests that we should be more cautious, for example, about rinsing and drying our fishing gear, especially when we move from one system to another, to limit the distribution of this parasite. especially if it turns out that our study shows that it has a significant effect on the health of the fish.
We'll continue on to your next research project. Currently, you are studying the presence of cyanobacteria in the City of Moncton's drinking water reservoir.
That's right.
Why is it important to monitor the presence of cyanobacteria in Moncton's drinking water reservoir?
Cyanobacteria are also known as blue-green algae. A lot of people refer them. You may have heard of them in the news. Lake Erie, again this summer, has turned a lovely shade of green from these cyanobacteria. Lake Winnipeg, for a number of years now, has suffered from significant blooms. The reason why people are worried, not just drinking water supply, but also recreational use of the water impacts to fish or fisheries, like Lake Winnipeg supported a fishery, is that these organisms can produce, not always, but can produce toxins. These toxins, there's no known antidote. They're very rapid. There's two types, one that affects the liver, one that affects the brain. They're fast acting. I know of one case about 3 years ago, a young Labrador drank from a puddle of water that had these cyanobacteria in them and was dead in 35 minutes.
Wow.
So very quick. So these toxins can't be eliminated by boiling the water either. You don't want them present in your lakes, period, whether it's a drinking water supply or not. So we did have a minor bloom in the drinking water supply. Monitoring was conducted to ensure that the water quality was still there. As I mentioned, they don't necessarily produce toxins. So the question we surveyed, and there was no indication the levels were of any toxins that were present were well below the set standards for human health. That said, there's reason to continue monitoring to make sure that the situation doesn't change. And we're also looking at perhaps techniques to remove excessive nutrients. Part of the explanation behind these blooms is an abundance of nutrients, at least elsewhere. Lake Erie and Lake Winnipeg, there's certainly cases of excess nutrients. So we're looking at, this year we're drawing up plans to install floating vegetation mats. We're going to be using native species. They're anchored in a floating substrate. It looks a little bit like a mat. The plants grow rapidly. They absorb the nutrients from the water. They grow at the top, and then you harvest the biomass in the fall. And you remove it, you can compost it and use it as compost. And the roots stay intact. Usually you pull this up onto the shoreline. There are even machines that you can run the mat through. And the green stuff is automatically harvested off the top. The roots are left intact, and you put it back out again in the spring. So we're looking at this as, to my knowledge, these floating mats are more common in the US. They've got a bit more problems than we do. So they're a bit more advanced. But there are other places in New Brunswick that have this problem. I know of one of them that's at least another drinking water supply, in some cases recreational. So we're trying to be progressive on this. Monitoring, yes, it's highly important, but you'd like to prevent. And this is a technique that's out there that we want to test as a pilot project. If it's successful, then it can be adopted more widely. But still, we have to look after our watersheds and ensure that nutrients and sediments don't flow into our watershed, which can only aggravate the problem.
Have they been successful in the United States with mats?
There's no doubt that these mats will absorb nutrients. The question is, how big do they need to be? How efficient are the species that they're using? In this case, we want to use native plant species. We don't want to introduce a species that might become invasive or grow out of control or spread elsewhere. Certainly, cattails are very good at absorbing excess phosphorus, and they've been used elsewhere, but they're not the only known species that can be used for this. Cattails also are not eaten by geese, so that's the other thing we want to keep in mind. We don't want to create a magnet for Canada geese.
Right.
So if we're planting these vegetation mats, we don't want them to say, oh, well, that's a nice place to have a family. And as a result, defecate in the water and actually increase the nutrients.
So what is the nutrient source of cyanobacteria?
The two major nutrients of importance are phosphorus and nitrogen. Phosphorus is generally looked at as the most important because cyanobacteria are able to assimilate nitrogen from the atmosphere and convert it into a form that they can use for growth. So they're generally not seen as being limited by nitrogen. Phosphorus, yes, normally phosphorus is at a fairly low concentration in fresh water. Sources of phosphorus are multiple. It can come from use of fertilizers, it can come from septic fields, from sewage outflow, It can come from exposed soils that can bring in as well. One of the difficulties is once phosphorus is in the system, it's recycled. What happens is it's used by not just cyanobacteria, but by algae to grow during the spring and the summer. In the fall, when the water temperatures drop, those die. They fall to the bottom in the sediment. In a lot of cases, the bottom sediments are anoxic. There's no oxygen. Under those conditions, phosphorus is redissolved, becomes soluble again in the water. In the spring, when we get another changeover of the water, we call lake circularization, where the bottom waters come to the top and everything becomes a uniform temperature. All those nutrients come back to the surface and it's recycled again, so you get a bloom, so you're locked into this vicious cycle.
So does a high percentage of the phosphorus become recycled, or is it decreased greatly through this process?
The only way it's going to leave the system is if there's an outflow. There are techniques for actually capping it in the sediment. By capping would mean you treat it so that it can't redissolve into the water and circulate back up. And one of their commercial products for that, the most probably well known is Phoslock, and it actively binds with the phosphorus and keeps it in the sediment. So when the spring comes around, it's not resuspended back into the water. Prior to that, there were more extreme methods like dredging. Lake Geneva in Switzerland had a bad problem with cyanobacteria, and they dredged.
What is dredging?
Dredging, remove the sediments. You remove the sediments with a crane. You go out there in the water and you drop a big shovel down to the bottom, or you vacuum in some cases, or both.
Wow.
It's a bit like dredging a harbor. You may have heard of dredging a harbor, where they dig out the sediments to increase the depth of the harbor.
Okay.
In this case, it's removing these sediments that are rich in phosphorus. But it's equipment, costly, and you're removing more than just the sediments. There's a possibility of resuspending whatever's in the sediment.
I was going to say, there must be impacts to that.
Oh yes, yeah. You can't do that without having some effect on the environment. So seeing is very extreme versus treating with something to basically make sure that the phosphorus is not available for uptake. There are other products. Alum has been used, which is a form of aluminum. But people are wary about high levels of aluminum in their drinking water. The product used in Phoslock at the levels for being effective is non-toxic to humans. There have been lots of background studies done on it. Actually, when the Olympics were held in China, they had a problem where they were doing the rowing events.
Oh, I remember that.
Yeah, it was bright green, again from a bloom, so they treated it with Phoslock there, and it cleared up the water in time for the Olympics. So
it works quite rapidly.
The product does work fairly rapidly,
Yes.
You may have to reapply, depending upon the situation.
So it's a Band-Aid, kind of?
Exactly. If the phosphorus is still coming into the system, you haven't corrected the problem. So it's really the health of your watershed and identifying input sources. Our floating vegetation mats. In the case of our particular water supplies, there's no smoking gun. They're in a very well forested watershed, and there's nothing really that springs to mind. Again, global warming can be driving the system. The water temperatures are higher. There is a hypothesis out there that with the warmer, normally what happens, you have to understand a bit the routine in the past, is normally what happens in the spring is you have a bloom of organisms that we call diatoms. Now the diatoms are much more efficient than the cyanobacteria in absorbing nutrients when the water
Do they have the
temperatures
same
are
nutrient
low.
source, phosphorus and
That's
nitrogen?
right. So they use the phosphorus and nitrogen that's in the water, just like the cyanobacteria, but they're better at it when the water temperatures are colder.
Oh,
So if you have global warming, you have warmer water temperatures in the spring, and this favors cyanobacteria. So normally the diatoms would remove the excessive nutrients in the spring, not excessive, I shouldn't say excessive, would remove the nutrients in the spring. That means there's only minor quantities left for the regular algae, so
to
they
keep
would
the
use
population in check.
That's right. By the time the regular algae have used the nutrients, there's very little left for the cyanobacteria. So you don't have a bloom because other organisms before them have already used it up. But now with warmer water temperatures in the spring, the cyanobacteria are there first. They work better at the job when the water temperatures are warmer. So they get a whole head start on the whole system, and as a result, we get blooms.
Do you think these diatoms could evolve to work in warmer climates? Or do you think that would take years and years for them to kind of adapt?
Well, it would require a fundamental change in metabolism. It's like saying that humans, all of a sudden, we could increase our body temperature above 37 degrees. Right. And we would be fine. We could operate at the temperature that.
So it's unlikely.
With a fever, yeah, because all of the enzymes, all of the metabolic system in the diatoms are optimally functional at that temperature. You need something radical like a mutation. So at the moment, we're conducting monitoring. It's done. I don't want to give the impression that I'm running the whole project. It's being done in collaboration with Heather Fraser of the City of Moncton. We've been working on this project for a number of years. There's also the other end that's looking at what can be done at the treatment plant itself. So if there were toxins present, how could we remove them? How could we neutralize them? There are various techniques for that, but they all tend to be expensive. So the best treatment is to avoid having any present to start with. So that's keeping your watershed in good health, making sure you don't have a lot of nutrients in there. Maybe because of the global warming, we'll have to have concentrations of phosphorus below what has been suggested in the past as being the optimal level that you shouldn't go above. Maybe we have to do better than that now because of the warmer water temperatures. We have to go to levels below that.
Is there a drinkable level of? If
it's a relatively a new threat. There are suggested guideline levels. Okay. Again, there's a lot of research being conducted at the moment. Some of the questions are long term. If you drink this water even at a low level, what's the effect after 20 years of drinking? And we really don't have the answers to that at the moment. But the levels we detected so far are well below the suggested guidelines, so we're at the lower end. So at this stage, I would say there's no reason to be concerned. There's active monitoring going on, there's active testing going on. It's at a frequent interval, so it's being looked at. The health of the water supply and the users is number one here.
Right. So we read on your website that you're really interested in the human impacts on ecosystems.
Yes.
So in your opinion, what is the worst human impact to the ecosystem in the Greater Moncton area?
I think the best thing we could do at the moment, I would say not just the Moncton area, but for all our freshwater systems is what I say, keep the dirt out. Keep the suspended sediments out of the brooks and streams. Anytime you disturb the soil layer, if there are not appropriate measures in place, it's not done at the appropriate time, they're not mitigation measures, you have a heavy rainfall, and those sediments get washed into the river or stream. I've already mentioned that soils can carry additional phosphorus into the streams, but the sediments in themselves cover the bottom substrate, means that oxygen exchange is difficult. So eggs can be smothered. Depending upon the quantity and the type of suspended sediment, it can abrade the gills of the fish. So it can have a direct impact on the health of the fish. And to keep those sediments out, it implies a whole series of things like having riparian zones intact. And having riparian zones intact also means we keep water temperatures down. So by keeping sediments out of our brooks and streams, the methods required to do that also bring with it other benefits. And those benefits together increase the health of our streams.
So as humans, how do we disturb this sediment soil layer that you just described?
Are we talking ATV?
Well, the sources can be numerous. It's certainly anything that breaks down the banks along the stream, anything that creates an active surface for runoff. Again, exposed soils, no barriers, soils not covered beforehand, certainly before a rain. All of those will contribute to increased sediment load. And really, it is somewhat of a difficult task in that all you need is one breach across the riparian zone. You can have it intact for kilometers, but all you need is somewhere in the headwaters to have a gap, and all the sediment pours into that gap. And it's because we have an upstream downstream effect that's transported all the way downstream. So it's a bit frustrating in that you have a pretty good riparian zone everywhere, but all you need is just one area for entry of sediments, and you can lose a year of brook trout spawning.
An entire year.
Year.
Now, for our listeners, can you describe what a riparian zone is?
Riparian zone is simply the vegetation that borders both sides of the stream. In New Brunswick, there's 30 minimal buffer zone by law that you have to respect. It's there to ensure the stability of the banks. It also provides a certain food source for the fish in the stream. It can also provide nesting habitat for mammals. So it's simply the zone of vegetation that we leave on both sides of the stream. It's not 30 is the minimum. On steeper slopes, it may be deemed that a larger one is needed, 60 meters. On really steep slopes, 100 meters. So the idea is to provide cooling, provide a food source, ensure that the banks are stable, that you don't have sediment running into the stream. So cooling, it can intercept nutrients, for example, in the runoff water, the runoff that I mentioned from exposed soils. Well, if there's a riparian zone, they can act as a natural filter and prevent that from actually running into the stream.
So it acts as a buffer between the environment and a possible human impact? That's
right.
Do people generally go along with this riparian zone, or do people kind of cross the boundaries and break the law here in New Brunswick?
Well, I can't comment on the break the law part, but as far as adopting these methods, and I take the case of my own uncle to go back a number of years. When he first arrived, this is in Cape Breton, the cattle went right down to the stream, and there was no fence, And I remember as a child going out to fetch the cows in the morning, 4:30, 4 o'clock, and noticing back then that
it's quite early.
That the banks and the cows were going right into the stream, and the result that it was having. But that was always the way he did it.
They severely impact erosion of the banks,
that's right.
Correct? Yeah. Do they have any other impact on the stream?
If they defecate in the water, yes.
Right.
Yeah, defecate and urinate in the water, they're contributing.
They're no balance.
So it requires a change in mindset. Back then, the whole environmental movement and the effect on the environment simply didn't exist.
Yeah.
That was the way that his father did it, and saw no reason to change. So we know more about the processes and what we do and how it affects the land. There's definitely room for change. And in fact, in some cases, it's almost self-defeating, because at the same time, although he was giving access to his cows to water, it means that the pasture land that he had for grazing for his cattle got a little smaller every year.
Right.
Because part of his banks were falling into the river was getting larger. So as a result, his pasture land was decreasing. So by actually putting a riparian zone, yes, he might lose, a 30-meter buffer initially, but he would no longer be losing his pasture land to erosion into the stream. Plus, he'd be contributing to the overall wildlife of his piece of property. If he was a hunter, possibly to grouse and pheasant and other birds, if he was interested in that. So there would be additional benefits, and also knowing that he was contributing to perhaps better brook trout fishing in the stream for if he had children or whatever, successive generations, that opportunity would be there for future generations.
Is there anything else not preserved?
I think a lot of it is a level of consciousness. People have to be aware of the current state and what can be done. My advice would be to drive into parts of the upper watershed and take a look at streams in their natural state, where they
That's
have
great advice. Yeah.
good vegetation. See what a stream in good health looks like, and then come back to a more populated center and take a look.
And look at the comparison.
And compare
It'll be
the
quite
two.
stark. Yeah.
Go out, take a look at the bottom, take a look at the gravel. Stream intact, you see nice clear gravel, clear water. The water temperatures are low. There are brook trout in there, other species as well. And then compare that to an urban setting and tell yourself, what's the best? What would you like? There's no reason why we can't have streams in an urban setting that support aquatic life. And it should be a goal. It should be a target. Why can't we go brook trout fishing within a city? There's nothing integral in that means that you can't. Why not? Set it as a target. And to understand that, I think you have to actually go out. It's very pleasant out there. Rolling hills, Albert County. It's a wonder. The project I had this summer with the parasite study, I went into smaller tributaries that I had never explored before in the 28, 30 years that I've been in Moncton. I said, my gosh, it's beautiful back here.
sight.
And it's really, and there are beautiful little streams, wonderful habitat. Okay, so I would encourage people, go out, take your walking stick, your hiking stick, put your sunscreen on, take some bug spray, and go out and explore some of these little streams and see for yourself what a good quality stream looks like.
Be safe and enjoy.
And set targets in your environment, your local environment. Raise your voice and say, as a citizen, I would like to be able to go brook trout fishing, in my area. What can be done? What should be done? And I think one of the things is working with groups like what we have that are monitoring Petitcodiac Watershed a lot and looking at what they're going to try to improve, and also as a source of...
Yeah, so speaking of the Petitcodiac Watershed Alliance, we paired up with the University of Moncton to install an American eel ladder in Irishtown Nature Park.
Yep.
Why was this ladder installed in the first place, and what was the process that went into installing this?
The reason for the eel ladder was because I pushed for one.
Is that so?
Yes.
The dam itself needed repair. There were leaks, so it was either decommission or repair the dam. That particular reservoir had been there for a long, long time. There was a whole ecosystem established around that. Mm-hmm. So it was a question of benefits and negative aspects. If you were to remove it, what would happen versus the benefits of retaining it. And it was decided that the benefits outweighed. There were nesting birds, ospreys, eagles. Decommissioning it would have been a significant impact. We knew there were eels in there because, again, with the City of Moncton and again with Heather Fraser, we had been out sampling. I had suggested that before we do the repair to look at the fish, and also part of the Irishtown Nature Park inventory and we caught significant numbers of eels. We were using standard little mini minnow traps that they call them. They're about 1.5 meters, 2 feet. They're cylindrical. And some of them were packed with 5 or 6 eels. And eels were basically forcing themselves to squeeze through the little hole to get at the other fish that had entered the trap. So by the time we got there were just scales left and 5 or 6 very happy looking eels.
So that's when you guys realized it would be very beneficial to repair.
That's right. Obviously they were getting in there probably through the cracks and fissures. You have to know a little bit about the life cycle of American eel. But in the springtime, they arrive as what we call elvers. They're 6-7 centimeters long. They're worm-like, thread-like in form. They can migrate across wet substrate, across grass.
Now, how do they move across a wet substrate?
Well, they move a bit like a snake, what we call a serpentine movement. So the advantage for the serpentine movement, if you imagine an S, where the S bends, that bending part pushes against the substrate and it gives kind of a takeoff force that advances the alver or advances the snake. So it's that bending of the body that enables the animal to push against the ground or the vegetation that drives it forward because they have no legs. A snake has no legs and neither does an alver. So they use this to propel themselves forward. And all they need is a wet substrate. So even wet grass alongside of the dam that had the holes in it, the older dam, would have been enough for them to get through. And obviously the young ones were getting through because there were eels in there.
That's incredible.
So we said, well, geez, when we put in the new dam, there are no longer going to be those cracks present. There's no longer going to be water.
Which would decrease their population significantly because they couldn't get to the reservoir.
That's right. And at that time, eels were a species of concern. It's now a species of risk. It meant that the populations had gone down significantly. So we said the populations are at a low. We want to do our part to ensure that the little ones can get back. I mentioned to the contractors, can we include a eel ladder? And this is the first eel ladder that was built, and nobody has told me otherwise since. So it was new. I gave a reference to the contractors, a Dr. Harold in the U.S. that had lots of experience building these structures, to consult with him on the best design in Irishtown. And they adopted the idea to be put in a structure that would assist, and that explains how it got there.
Nice. So how does this eel ladder work?
The idea behind the eel ladder is to decrease the slope The alvers, if the flow isn't too great, they can actually climb a vertical wall of about 1.5 meters, maybe 2 meters. They wiggle their way along the substrate. So in the bottom of that eel ladder, if you go have a close look, you'll see that there are cobbles that are cemented into the bottom. And the cobbles are there to provide kind of a refuge out of the main current. So they basically worm their way through the cobbles that are cemented in the bottom and work their way up the ladder and finally are able to enter the reservoir at the other end. So it's a question of decreasing the slope, decreasing the flow, providing more of a gradual ramp into it, providing a substrate in the bottom that decreases the amount of the current so that they can actually swim up. In some cases, they've installed other things than cobbles. They've installed things that look like bristles, spaced apart, that act a little bit like cobbles, except they go a little higher up into the current. Okay. And also in some cases they've planted that looks like a little like the orange pylon cones that you see on highways, except they're a miniature version of that. And the same idea, they're cemented to the bottom and the eels go between those little pylons and work their way up.
So is this eel ladder working?
The study that we've done indicates that by capturing fish below and capturing fish above and capturing some within the structure, is they're having difficulty using it.
Why do you think that is?
Our idea on that is that there are sections that are perhaps too steep and the current flow is too high. They simply get exhausted before they finally make it. There are some in the lower part which suggests that the entry part is not the problem, but there are some pretty abrupt sections that they have to go up. It's possible, we had discussed PWA along with myself, that perhaps we could retrofit that somehow, decrease the angle of the slope, or perhaps put more significant structures in the bottom, cut off the entryway for a while, let it go dry, and install like the bristles that I was mentioning or cones that would provide a bottom layer where the current wasn't quite as hard, quite as fast, so that they would have a better chance of getting through the structure.
Now, how high is the Irish Tow Dam? How high do these eels have to go to reach where they want to get?
I don't know the specific height. If you had asked me when they were building it, I probably had it by heart then. But we're talking at least about, let's say, 10, 11 meters, somewhere around 35 feet, somewhere around that.
That's quite high.
It's too high for them to jump.
Too high. Yes.
They don't jump anyway.
And are these all juveniles in the reservoir?
Juveniles, for American eel, juveniles are the stage you're going to find in freshwater after the alver.
Oh, okay.
The alver is the form. Well, actually, when they come in from their ocean, they're referred to as glass eels. And they look like little strands of spaghetti that are transparent with a little ball at the top, which is their head. And they're quite transparent. It's a mechanism to avoid predation. If you're not seen, you can't be eaten. So when they come into fresh water, they undergo a change and become alvers. And the alvers become more solidly colored, kind of more of a whitish color on the belly, and a dark green on the top. Again, this is a camouflage against the bottom. They're harder to see. The white belly, if you're looking up from the bottom, if you're a predator fish looking up, the white blends in with the sky, so it makes them difficult to see. If it's a predator from above looking down below, they blend in because of the dark color of the back.
Whoa.
So after that, they're in the fresh water. They become mainly carnivorous, that is, they eat other fish. They still will eat some insects. When they get really large, they might even go after small waterfowl, baby waterfowl, when they get really, really big.
Just like what you saw in the cages, correct?
They'll eat small fish for sure. Yeah, yeah. And I believe they're quite intelligent. If that happens, if you're doing another study and you put your cage back in, the same eels will come back because they know there's a free dinner. Free dinner available.
Free dinner over here.
So once they're in fresh water, they will stay there for up to 22 years. Then they go back in the fall, go back downstream. They undergo a transformation for life in the sea. They stop eating, so they depend entirely on their fat reserves that they collected in fresh water. That's usually one. And then they migrate along the bottom of the floor bed all the way down to the Sargasso Sea, so they're at extreme depth. At the Sargasso Sea, we know they're there, but we still haven't been able to film, because they're not just our eels, the American eels, but also the European eels, all spawn in the same place.
Oh.
But they managed to separate. There's genetic differences between the two. So somewhere in the bottom, the whole population of North America, including the Great Lakes, it has to be a massive spawning. All spawn in the same spot.
I would not want to be down there.
At great depth and great pressure. We haven't been able to spawn them in captivity because we believe that pressure is necessary for the females. So the pressure is a critical part in the maturation of the females and their eggs. So then they spawn, never observed yet. The eggs have a little bit of oil in them, so they're less dense than water. They float to the top. They hatch out.
So cool.
And they basically ride the Gulf Stream. They're not very good swimmers. They ride the Gulf Stream. Part of the population separates off, goes across the Atlantic Ocean, 4,000 or 5,000 kilometer journey. The others head up the other branch of the Gulf Stream, and as they go by our continent, they spin off and they head for the closest river. And unlike Atlantic salmon, they're not they don't home to the river in which they matured. So they don't have a home fidelity unlike Atlantic salmon. They're influenced by the fresh water coming out. They pick up on that. There might be additional things like the magnetic field. They probably can sense the magnetic field. We're not too sure what determines how many spin off where, but they continue to do that all the way up to Newfoundland, where the last group of them finally
They have
spin
quite the
off.
complicated life cycle.
They do. We can
incredible.
ask, why so complicated? And what's behind this big
Right.
migration across 4,000 kilometers? Very risky. Lots of predators on the way. You've got to have enough energy to get across. And we believe the explanation between that, if you go back in historical times to the ancestor of American eels, it was when the Atlantic Ocean was just forming. And at that time, there was not a separation of 4,000 or 5,000 kilometers. The continents were much closer together. So
Pangea.
yeah, back then maybe they had only like 100 kilometer swim before they'd reach the continent. Gradually, it increased wider and wider to the size of the Atlantic Ocean we had today. And they maintained the strategy as long as the strategy of covering that distance to the streams enabled the population to reproduce and survive. There was no pressure to change that strategy. It's a bit of the same explanation as to why the penguins, the emperor penguins walk so far inland. What's behind that? Well, originally we believed they were much closer to the ocean. But since there was nothing to select against it, it's been retained. So there's nothing to select against the eels making that long journey across the Atlantic Ocean. So up until now, it's been maintained as a
Interesting.
It's like an ancient homecoming.
This
I can't
is
believe
so
that.
very
cool.
ancient. Very ancient. Yeah,
So
very-
in our Petitcodiac watershed, we still have a lot of barriers to fish passage. Is this impacting the abundance of the American eel? If yes, what should we do to help the population get across these barriers?
It's a good question. We do have some idea on American eels on the river. Apart from that, there's incidental bycatch through electrofishing efforts. There's the smolt wheel, which also picks up eels as well. So we have a number of devices to give us an idea. The major hindrance, of course, would be to these glass eels. They're not powerful swimmers. So if they encounter a culvert where there's no way to bypass around the culvert, there's too much of a drop for them to get up and go through the culvert, that's definitely blocking the passage. The only way to get around that is if there was a gradual slope and it was humid. Glass eels will migrate en masse
Onto the land.
and bypass,
Yeah.
on the land and bypass. That would have to be done at night, but you can't really depend upon that
you
for the
cannot.
survival of the
No.
species. They have to get through naturally. I can say with the study that I'm doing this year, where we're looking for brook trout, we did see quite a few juvenile eels. We leave them alone. You can see them as they respond to the electrofishing, but we just let them be. They scoot under the rocks. They're not our target species, but it's easy to know when there's an eel because they're entirely different from any other fish species.
Yes. Yeah.
So you can't misidentify them. So we've seen quite a few juveniles, which is looks good in the streams.
Looks good.
Yeah, but we're still in the early stages. We've only done 4 streams so far, but in those we have seen.
How many streams are you guys planning on doing?
We're doing up to a maximum of 10. Our permit allows it.
Which is a lot.
Yeah, I'm not even sure we're going to reach those levels. I was perhaps a bit optimistic. It takes a bit of time what we're doing, not only just to get out there, but to do the kinds of studies that we're doing. It's time consuming, these high temperatures that we're having. In some cases, some days we simply haven't gone out, because even if you leave at 5:30, overnight temperatures only go down to 20 degrees. By the time you get out there, the temperature is already shot up above 22 degrees and really stressful. You want to be 22 degrees or below air temperature. So it means very, very early mornings to get out there. Any electrofishing that we want to do or manipulation. There's one part of the experiment where there are actual in pens waiting. But as long as we have all that set up before the air temperatures go above. To our advantage, some of these streams are very well shaded. They've got a lot of very good riparian zones, as we mentioned earlier. So even if the air temperature there is still, let's say, climbs to 26, 27, under those trees, it's still down to the overnight temperature of 18 or so, which gives you a couple more hours than you would think normally to actually do your work. But still...
Another importance for riparian zones.
Yes, absolutely.
Research.
But still, I must say, we went out some mornings where it was 18 degrees and it warmed up so rapidly that there was actually vapor coming off the water. The water was like 12 degrees and the air temperature was already 26.
Wow.
And where the sun hit the water, it was like a fog coming off the water. There was that big a difference in temperature between the two. And I've never really seen that for a stream. On lakes, I've seen it in the fall because the lakes are warmer than the air temperature. But I've never seen the reverse, where the air temperatures were so high and the water temperatures were so low that you were getting a physical vapor coming off the water.
Beautiful, but kind of...
It was intriguing, but a little disconcerting that the water temperatures that early in the day had reached such a high.
Yeah.
But on the positive side, the water temperatures were still quite low, 12 degrees despite all that.
Yes, that's good.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much for indulging us about the eel ladder. I understand all of this amazing research and everything that you do. You are a university professor.
That's right.
Of biology.
Université de Moncton, where I teach a number of biology courses. But I've always had an interest in the environment. One Alliance, we had a different name back then, but started very early. As far as I know, I was one of the first locally to do kind of a habitat evaluation on Halls Creek. Back then, it was with black and white film, colored slides.
Wow.
So I went out.
That's coming back though. With
and walked the whole thing, and that was new back then. These were different. The gates had been installed on the Petitcodiac back then, but it had heard the stories about when the first year of running them, that the salmon came up, couldn't make it through the gates, and as the water level went down, they got stranded trying to save the salmon and put them back in the water because the tide went down so fast that they got stranded. Putting them back, there were still a few that were getting in there. The inner Bay of Fundy stocks were in difficulty, but certainly hadn't gone down or disappeared in some. So there was still hope back then for natural rebound. The inner Bay of Fundy stock has always been an interesting one. They have a different strategy than Atlantic salmon elsewhere. It's believed from day one that they've got more of a risk as far as not surviving. So they were multi-spawners, and what we mean by that is they came back multiple times to spawn as a way of compensating for bad years. So we believe they've always had bad years, but the way of getting around that is to come back more frequently, spawn repeatedly, and hopefully within your lifespan you'll get a good reproductive input, and that all balances off in the long run. And unlike salmon on the Gulf side, it was believed that they didn't go to Greenland to spawn. So a totally different approach, a totally different genetics. Even today, we feel it's worth preserving.
Now, our final question is, what is the hardest part about teaching biology to university students? Or what is the hardest part about teaching in general?
I think the most challenging part is probably keeping current. Biology it advances. There's lots and lots of discoveries. And even within the lifespan of your textbook, my general biology textbook gets revised about every 4 to 6 years. And easily within 4 years, there are things and it's doing enough reading to keep ahead of that. There's new techniques that are always coming out. Always looking for new and innovative ways to present captivating, that's interesting, that's modern, that will instill enthusiasm within my students. That, this is cool stuff, this is neat. And all along we're discovering more and more about ourselves. We're part of the ecosystem, we're living organisms. What we find out in others is applicable to ourselves in a lot of circumstances. So I think it's instilling the personal enthusiasm I have for the subject to my students.
And transferring that to your students.
That's right.
Yeah.
Do you guys ever go out into the fields?
Oh yes, we now have, we're not offering it this year, but we introduced a new, it's entirely field course. It's a 1 week, it's a 1 week intensive outing where we visit a number of habitats. It's brand new, we've offered it only once. We do rivers and streams, aquatic habitat. We do forestry, botany type of outings within there. We do a mammal component where we installed cameras along streams and captured animals coming down to drink water, like deer. We've got some very nice pictures of deer.
Bears?
No bears. We got
moose.
No moose. We got squabbling raccoons.
Squabbling raccoons.
Yeah, we had raccoons come down, and there was some kind of fight that broke out among a number of them.
Oh my goodness.
Did you guys get that all on film?
Yeah. We have snapshots of them.
You should upload that to YouTube.
Do some voiceovers.
Well, they're just snapshots because you save on the battery life, so periodically it takes a snapshot.
Gotcha.
But you can see one arrive and then more arrive.
This could be a meme waiting to happen.
Yes,
It's funny.
So there was some kind of squabble that went on there. So we did. We took them out, and they looked at trees, did evaluation of trees. The bog, I think, was the most interesting part because there's unique fauna in bogs and unique insect life that occurs only in bogs, and there are mammals and birds that are unique to that area as well. It's just a cool place to go for a field trip.
Yeah.
Your students must loved it.
It was a lot of fun. It
Yeah.
was a lot of fun. An awful lot of walking, a lot of hauling of equipment. You're probably familiar with that. You've got your meter, all your various meters to measure the water quality parameters, rulers, notebooks, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
You're wearing rubber boots or hip waders on a very warm day.
Yeah.
But you soon forget all about that once you're out there and you're seeing all kinds of stuff that you've never seen before, and how they make their living and how they survive. And those.
How could you not love it?
Yeah, everybody that took that course, the question was, when is it going to be offered again? We all had an excellent time, including the professors. There were 3 professors, there were 3 profs on that.
That's exciting.
So
yeah, it must be a nice break for you guys too.
yeah, it's offered outside. It's offered before the start of the regular courses because it's a week. And there were invited speakers, in the field as well. We had hymns, we had a few evening sessions where there were just invited speakers, experts in either the aquatic or so anytime you can make any course pertinent to what's happening in the real world, I call it outside the classroom.
It helps. Real world applications really help understanding, I find, especially for me when I'm learning.
At least for the ecological field.
Yes, especially in the environmental.
The environmental stuff is the real world is outside the 4 walls.
Yeah.
And you have to understand the theory that you're learning, and you don't really see how it applies.
Yeah. Once
you get outdoors, okay, that I see now why water temperature is important. Oxygen concentration goes down, which means the brook trout may be difficult to live. So you make the link between the physical part that you learned in the class and the consequences. So conveying all of that and giving the whole picture and the necessary details is a challenge. Not to oversaturate, but provide essentials.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
You're very welcome.